business. Meanwhile, you and I need to find out about something else. The Law Commission. They're aiming to make it cheaper for leaseholders to buy freeholds or extend their lease. The Law Commission has set out a range of proposals which said that it will make it cheaper for Britain's 4 million leaseholders to buy their freehold or extend their lease. However, the reforms were immediately branded by campaigners as nothing more than tinkering. Well, who knows? Who knows who's right on this one? Mary-Ann Bowring is Group MD at Ringley. Joins me now. Mary-Ann, good morning to you.
Good morning.
So perhaps you'd like to tell me what the Law Commission have been looking into and what you think they're going to conclude.
Well, there's 3 schemes that are proposed at the moment, and the first one is to stop marriage value and hope value being payable. So to the layperson, hope value really applies when you're buying the freehold, and that could be the hope of building on the roof or the hope of future lease extensions. And there's a couple of proposals with that. One is to just outlaw it altogether, and the second is to make it payable to the freeholder, but only at the time the residents actually cash in and develop. So that's one proposal. Another proposal is to get rid of marriage value. The marriage value applies when a lease has less than 80 years unexpired. A marriage value basically is because you're merging 2 interests or marrying them, and there's a perceived gain to the leaseholder, and currently the leaseholder only pays 50% of that gain. The gain is basically calculated by the difference between a short lease and a long lease. So if the difference was £20,000, current law says if your lease is less than 80 years, you pay $10,000 or half of that.
Why shouldn't you have to pay some form of marriage value?
That's a very, very good question, and that will be having most freeholders reeling, I guess, because ultimately they sell a lease for a premium for a term of years. So perhaps you sell a 99-year lease, maybe for £500,000. And the current theory is every day your lease is getting shorter, it's one day closer to being owned, or the property being owned unencumbered, back by the freeholder. So effectively, these proposals are devaluing the freeholder's interest, which won't be popular at all. I think what the government's trying to achieve is to continue to go further and further in the consumer champions marketplace, and really try to deliver the equivalent of cash and carry lease extensions.
And this is partly because the process is currently quite complicated, but then on the other hand, valuation itself is quite complicated. And I've seen a few articles which have written it up, and it's very clear that those people writing these articles, particularly for the British Broadcasting Corporation, they've heard one side of the story, but they don't really understand that valuation is something that there's a difference sometimes between price and value. There's also a difference between the interest, if you like. And if you are a freeholder, and you want people to invest in a market, you have to make sure that that market is robust. And if you start taking away money from one side or the other, then the unintended consequences are quite profound, even though this report or the reports seem not to indicate that that's the case.
Well, the valuation aspect of a lease extension isn't greatly complicated, but it does have a lot of variables within it. I mean, for starters, there's the 7 factual variables, which is the lease length, the number of years unexpired, the date you want to make your lease extension claim, the date on your notice, the passing ground rents, the ground rent if it's rising every 30 years, and for freehold purchase, any extra property that you want to buy with the freehold. Because technically speaking, the freehold is what you buy off the house, let's say, that the flats are contained in, but the garden's appurtenant property. So those are relatively fixed because they're mostly factual. The variable factors, which the government or the Law Society is also, Law Commission rather, is also considering tinkering with, include the capitalisation rate, which really is an investment multiplier applied in the same way that you have an investment rate on the money markets. There's an investment rate for valuation and property. The deferment rate, which is the rate that decides how much the future value of the freehold, when the freeholder gets it back, is worth today. The value of the flat today, of course, the value of the flat after extension, that makes you your marriage value. And then, as we just mentioned before, hope value from development or future lease extensions. So that's the sum of the 14 variables that go into a valuation. One of the proposals is also to create a government or a prescribed calculator to help leaseholders be more clear about what their premium should be. Don't necessarily think that's necessary because enough of them out there on the internet already. But the other factors that the government wants to tinker with are potentially the capitalisation rate and the deferment rate.
Do you think it's
the money markets?
Right. Do you think it's right that the Law Commission are the people to set out what the reform should be?
Well, I've been part of the all-party government working group that was really headed up by LKP, Leasehold Knowledge Partnership, for some time, and the government's had Sir Peter Bottomley and others making quite a lot of noise in the House of Commons about the unfair treatment of leaseholders. So I think something has to be seen to be done. They're already proposing to erode the freeholders market insofar as new ground rents on new properties being £1 or peppercorn, so never demanded. But a freeholder needs to have a reason to invest in property. Otherwise, we get to the sort of purely European type market where everything becomes common hold and, in some respects, uneducated, non-professional landlords become the norm. That has a challenge for the desire to necessarily maintain things every 5 years, as the lease might say. So it could lead to a declining quality of the UK housing stock at worst. At best, some of these things are not too bad and are perhaps compromises, i.e. deferring hope value to when the leaseholders actually make a development. That's kind of fair, because if the freeholder hadn't already developed his property, why should he get some cash now for the fact that somebody else might, when they might not?
Indeed. Now, let's bring in a market aspect to this, if I can. Marianne, hang on there. I just want to bring in Ed Mead. He's an independent property expert, but also founder of Vuber. Ed, you've been listening to what Marianne has to say about this. When it comes to the market and operating and operations of it, to me, if we're not careful, there is going to be a law of unintended consequence. And the Law Commission proposals could have a very negative impact on the property market if we're not careful.
Well, I couldn't really add a lot to what Marianne has said, and I think that the issue is obviously has become a bit of a knee-jerk reaction to what I would describe as a little bit of greed, really, from some of the house builders having added or tried to sell particularly houses on leases with rather ridiculous lease ground rent escalating costs. And this has all become a bit of a knee-jerk reaction to that. I think there's also been the issue over the years, which definitely has created a problem in the market, which is the deferment rates and the capitalisation interest rates that Marianne referred to, because obviously as interest rates have lowered, the amount of money required to invest to produce a certain amount of income, i.e. ground rent, has clearly gone up as interest rates have gone down from 5, 6, 7% down to 0.5%, 0.75%. It takes much more capital to do that. So that's really where the market has suffered to some extent, and it's also the uncertainty. And markets don't like uncertainty, but the system itself has worked perfectly well for 100 years and more, and I think it does make sure. One thing the market really likes about it is that it keeps property looking good. I think there's an awful lot to be careful about.
Because one of the things is that I read an article on the BBC about this, and they seem to forget the fact that there is a valuation side when it comes to their analysis. How many people really understand, do you think, not only the methodology, but also whether or not it's reasonable that somebody should get, whether it's hope value or marriage value? Because if, for example, you were to extend a lease, and there's a formula to it, and then suddenly there's an uplift in the value of your flat because you've extended the lease, is it fair and reasonable that you, the tenant, get all that value?
Well, I think the fact is that the valuation itself has always been a subjective issue that includes demand as well as supply, and it's why automated valuation models, as you and I have discussed often before in the past, James, won't work. And I think it's absolutely vital that both sides have the ability to be able to try and prove what they do, and therefore the RICS should be brought into this, and it is a professional job for surveyors.
Mary-Ann, what do you make of that?
I agree to a certain extent. I mean, the capitalisation rate has such a limited input to the valuation in relation to all of the other factors. The deferment rate is the one that makes the biggest difference. But ultimately, you've still got to have a valuer to decide the current value of the property and the value of the property once the lease is extended. So the need for a valuer is still going to exist. In answer to your other question, no, most leaseholders don't understand the array of factors and the implications of each and how they all intertwine with each other.
But why has the RICS not been at least, I don't know, consulted on this? They seem not to have had a word in any respect of it.
That's a very good question. I'm not being a representative of the RICS per se, wouldn't like to comment, but I believe they definitely should. Because valuation is a science and an art. It's a mixture of the two. It's not just pure mechanics.
Because you see, this is the problem with this proposal, in my view, is that they're trying to turn something which is, to an extent, an opinion, and they're trying to turn it into something which is commoditized into a formula. And as soon as you do that, somebody or some people are going to lose out.
I think the objectives are twofold. One, to make it cheaper and what mechanisms can achieve that. And two, perhaps as there are so many factors in the valuation, to make a few of them certain. I think that was the aim. And of course, there's only so many factors they can tinker with. So they picked 4 of the 6 or 7 that need actual valuation science. Is a valuer going to charge any less because he's got 4 factors to assess, not 6 or 7? Not really. So I don't know that it actually makes the fees element cheaper. It would be helpful, I guess, because it limits the margin of negotiation for the freeholder. So the unscrupulous freeholders who try to just ransom people by holding out to the last day before the tribunal to settle, while the leaseholder's racking up lots of costs to be represented because they're scared, that's a practice that ought to be outlawed. But there are other ways of doing these things. I think the hope value deferment till it actually happens is fair. The rest of it, I think, is a little bit miscocked, I suppose.
Ed, just to you, so campaigners have now said that they're deeply disappointed by the Law Commission proposals. An individual by the name of Sebastian O'Kelly of the Leasehold Knowledge Partnership has said it's very difficult to be too enthusiastic about options to government which give £2.5 billion of annual leasehold enfranchisement sector plenty of scope to dilute any meaningful reform. In essence, there is no reform of this sector, and there are some people who simply think that leasehold enfranchisement is a racket and that they shouldn't have to pay very much to extend a lease. How on earth does one square that circle?
Well, I mean, you can't square a circle like that when it's actually a few, Mary-Ann just talked about unscrupulous landlords, and there are unfortunately some unscrupulous landlords out there who will simply refuse to answer any correspondence right up until the last minute. And one of the anomalies in the system is that the leaseholder has to pay all the costs for the freeholder. So if costs are mounting up, it's costing the leaseholder to do this. So there are certain things that can be changed. But the systems work perfectly well for a very, very long time. And it is greed, and there should be some, I think the idea that ground rent should be controlled to some extent, in that you shouldn't allow these absurd multipliers, doubling every 10 years and starting them at £1,000. There are certain basic, sensible ideas that I think can be picked up out of this and run with.
Okay, Ed, thank you very much indeed for joining me, and indeed to Mary-Ann Bowring, Group MD at Ringley, and Ed Mead, independent property expert and founder of Viewber. Thank you both very much for joining me talking about that. We turn our attention to the papers now.